Great, thank you, Adam. Hi, everyone. Welcome to, let me just get the official title, Flush Canine Relations. We have 3 speakers for this panel this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are. I think what we'll do is follow how the panels have proceeded so far, which is to have a short 1 or 2 minute break between papers, just to allow people to sort of rejuvenate, and then we'll have group questions at the end. So we'll run in the order that is on the conference program. So we'll begin with Diana. Diana Royer is Professor of English at Miami University's regional campus in Hamilton, Ohio, where she teaches composition, American and British literature, women's studies, and film studies. Her most recent book is on detective fiction and film noir, and has literally just been published, just the start of this month, from McFarland. And it's titled The Essence of Film Noir, Style and Themes of Cinema's Dark Genre. And there is a discount code for that book that has been circulated, should you be tempted to pick up a copy for yourself. Diana's paper today is entitled A Dog Has a Character Just as We Have, the Ethical and Non-Ethical Treatment of Non-Human Animals in Woolf's Fiction.
Okay, thank you, Peter. The quotation in my paper title comes from Woolf's 1940 unpublished story, Gypsy the Mongrel, and completely reads, "A dog has a character just as we have, and it shows itself just as ours do, by what we say, by all sorts of little things." Woolf's fiction overall illustrates what Natalie Thomas, author of the book Animal Ethics and the Autonomous Animal Self, describes thusly. If animals can be understood to be self-aware, then it changes our view of them as merely objects for our use, to seeing them as individual selves deserving of moral consideration. From the beheaded chicken in The Voyage Out, to the mutilated fish into the lighthouse, to the commenting cows in Between the Acts, creatures in Woolf's fiction represent her view of proper ethics in human-animal relations. My analysis begins with Flush. Despite the tendencies of people to anthropomorphize pets, and while she did at times project human sensibilities upon him, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was forward-thinking in ethical behavior toward her Cocker Spaniel, which Woolf amplifies. Among the sources Woolf offers for her biography of Flush are 5 collections of Barrett's letters and 2 poems. In the poem To Flush, My Dog, Barrett deems him a gentle fellow creature, praises his sacrifice of outdoor freedom to remain within her invalid chambers to comfort her, and calls him a loving fellow creature. In the poem Flush or Faunus, the dog consoles her when she weeps, evoking her thanks for his love. I agree with Derek Ryan that in writing Flush, Woolf's aim, and I quote, "Woolf's aim is to use the imaginative, speculative nature of animal biography to challenge anthropocentrism rather than collide with it," close quote. Further, in moments occurring both in Barrett's poetry and Woolf's novel, both Flush and Barrett, quoting again, demonstrate an ethic toward the other at the moment of their gaze at each other. And that's a quote from Jamie Johnson, who argues that this decenters, quote, "the human anthropomorphic mode of being through an ethical responsibility towards one another," close quote. Flush gives up his freedom to be Barrett's companion. She risks her life to rescue him when he's dog-napped. In real life, Flush was dog-napped 3 times. Victorian dog stealers are written about in Henry Mayhew's 1851 book, London Labor and the London Poor, with him explaining their tactics, the use of a go-between like Mr. Taylor, and the threats of physical harm, all of which accord with Woolf's laying out of this process in Flush. Philip Howell notes that 2 especially striking aspects of dog stealing were its apparent professionalism and organization, the sense that this was a systematic attack on bourgeois property and propriety, and the viciousness implied or actual of the dog stealer's trade, close quote. That is, the threat to kill the dogs. Howell notes the anonymous beastliness of Flush's abductors, the brutalized poor of Whitechapel. Andrew Mean's 1883 article in the Pall Mall Gazette titled "The Bitter Cry of Outcast London" observed that the low parts of London are the sink into which the filthy and abominable from all parts of the country seem to flow. Here, the vilest practices are looked upon with the most matter-of-fact indifference, close quote. Elizabeth Barrett wanted to pay the ransom. Her brother Henry revealed this to their father, who ordered Henry to turn Mr. Taylor away unpaid and conceal his visit from Elizabeth. Her fiance, Mr. Browning, said that giving way to blackmailers was giving way to tyranny, was increasing the power of evil over right, of wickedness over innocence. Woolf quotes from letters actually exchanged between Barrett and Browning to highlight Barrett's determination to secure Flush's return by negotiating with Mr. Taylor. In a letter to Hugh Stuart Boyd, Barrett stated, "With great difficulty, we hunted the dog banditti into their caves of the city and bribed them into giving back their victim." In the same letter, she mentions her poem, Cry of the Children, an expose on industrialization that deals in part with the slums factory workers lived in. Barrett had read an illustrated parliamentary report titled "Report of the Royal Commission on the Employment of Children and Very Young People in Mines and Factories" that her friend Richard Hengist Horne helped write, which incited her to compose her poem. Thus, she knew the conditions of slums before braving them to get Flush out of the grasp of the dog nappers. Barrett called a cab, took her maid with her, and went to Whitechapel to retrieve Flush. Mr. Taylor was not at home, so she arranged for Mrs. Taylor to send him around with Flush as soon as he returned. Taylor arrived alone to collect the ransom, but Barrett's brother Alfred drove him away. Undaunted, Barrett declared she would go to Whitechapel again, whereupon her brother Septimus agreed to get Flush if she would go rest. Woolf does a good job conveying the point of view of the captive spaniel as helpless, hungry, abused, and hoping to be rescued. Flush was traumatized by his experience, so that subsequently, when the door opened, he started, expecting a hairy man with a knife. He doesn't trust Mr. Browning and other men. Behind those smiling, friendly faces were treachery and cruelty and deceit. I think here Woolf puts herself in the dog's perspective, achieving what Derek Ryan claims. Woolf explores a canine animality that continually disrupts anthropocentrism. As Tom Baggett in Woolf's short story Gypsy the Mongrel says, "I've often wondered what she was thinking of us down there among all the boots and old matches on the hearthrug. What was her world? Do dogs see what we see, or is it something different?" So he and his wife looked down at the boots and old matches, tried for a moment to lie nose on paws, gazing into the red caverns and yellow flames with the dog's eyes, but they couldn't answer that question. Gypsy severely agitated another dog they acquired, Hector, so they had to get rid of one of the dogs. They kept Gypsy because they feared she might not find a new home, just like a bad maid might not find a new position. Gypsy's behavior showed she missed Hector. Mr. Baggett says, "We never knew till then how much feeling she had in her. With human beings, they can speak, but with a dog, it's different. Dogs can't talk, but dogs," he added, "remember." Flush remembered his captivity, and Barrett remembered his devotion to her. She demonstrated her own devotion to this living creature by doing the ethical thing, not giving way to the tyranny of her father and fiance, and increasing the power of right over wickedness by retrieving Flush. In the voyage out, Evelyn Murgatroyd tells Rachel, who's looking out a hotel window, "They kill hens down there. They cut their heads off with a knife. Disgusting." Shortly after, looking out of a different window to the yard outside of the kitchen, deemed the wrong side of the hotel life, Rachel watches an old woman whose face was expressive of furious rage chase a chicken, catch it, and, holding it out, cut its head off with an expression of vindictive energy and triumph combined. The blood and the ugly wriggling fascinated Rachel until she looked up sharply because of the ugliness of what she had seen. Miss Allen remarks, "Not a pretty sight, although I dare say it's really more humane than our method." And a little upcoming warning about some grisly description here. According to the 1904 volume, Poultry Keeping as an Industry for Farmers and Cottagers, in England, and I quote, "The best method we know for slaughtering chickens is to hang the birds up by the legs and then thrust a pointed knife into the roof of their mouth, rather in a backward direction than to the top of the skull. This is in order to reach the brain, for then death ensues very speedily and with very little pain to the victim. The 1889 book, Piper's Poultry, a practical guide to the choice, breeding, rearing, and management of all description of fowls, turkeys, guinea fowls, ducks, and geese for profit and exhibition, observes, an easy mode of killing a fowl is to give the bird a very sharp blow with a small but heavy blunt stick, such as a child's bat or wooden sword, at the back of the neck, about the second or third joint from the head, which will, if properly done, sever the spine and cause death very speedily. But the knife is the most merciful means. The bird being first hung up by the legs, the mouth must be open wide, and a long, narrow, sharp-pointed knife, like a long penknife, which instrument is made for the purpose, should be thrust firmly through the back part of the roof of the mouth up into the brain, which will cause almost instant death. Another mode of killing is to pluck a few feathers from the side of the head, just below the ear, and make a deep incision there. There are too many qualifiers in all these described methods for me to be assured the chicken does not suffer distress and pain. In her article in the Virginia Woolf Miscellany, Becky Tipper asks, and how should we view and respond to animal suffering? Although for some writers, this is an abstract ethical issue, Ralph Acampora asserts that the question can only be addressed if we first consider how compassion for others' pain is felt in one's own body. For Acampora, empathy is fundamentally a visceral sensation that directly bridges the species abyss. Tipper notes that if one viscerally feels an animal's suffering in their own body, such moments might blur or collapse ordinary boundaries and binaries between self and other, between human and animal, beyond recognition. I think Rachel's recoiling from the sight of the slaughtered chicken, which physical movement, Miss Allen observes, indicates Woolf's awareness of, and hence fictional depiction of, empathy for non-human animal suffering. In part 3 of To the Lighthouse, Woolf separates two scenes in which Lily is crying and calling out for her dead friend, Mrs. Ramsay, with the bracketed passage, McAllister's boy took one of the fish and cut a square out of its side to bait his hook with. The mutilated body, it was alive still, was thrown back into the sea. In the second scene, it is noted that Lily's feelings, the pain increased. I read the bracketed passage about the fish as symbolic of how Lily feels. Losing Mrs. Ramsay felt like a piece of herself had been cut out. And Woolf, using this correlation between Lily and the fish, shows Woolf is aware of the fish as a creature that feels pain, making McAllister's boy's use of it for literally live bait a cruel act of torture. There are happily passages regarding animals in Woolf's fiction that move readers toward a more mutually uplifting relationship between human and non-human animals. In between the acts, at the point where Miss Latrobe is lamenting how the emotion she hoped the actors in her play would convey to the audience is not being sustained because the rising wind is making their words inaudible, then suddenly, as the illusion petered out, the cows took up the burden. One had lost her calf. In the very nick of time, she lifted her great moon-eyed head and bellowed. All the great moon-eyed heads laid themselves back. From cow after cow came the same yearning bellow, the whole world filled with dumb yearning. It was the primeval voice sounding loud in the ear of the present moment. Then the whole herd caught the infection. The cows annihilated the gap, bridged the distance, filled the emptiness, and continued the emotion. When the cows lower their heads and resume grazing, the audience lowers their heads to read their programs. The cows are a community, the pageant goers are a community, and Woolf joins those two communities. I find this one of the most beautiful commentaries on non-human-human connection and unity. In their introduction to a volume on how animals are represented in media, Amber George and J.L. Schatz write, beyond the question of non/humans' rights, we should give pause to consider how cultural representation affects the way humans relate and construct the world in oppressive ways. Through doing so, it is possible to theorize solutions that don't replicate other forms of oppression via the discursive practices we employ. To be fully moral beings living in this society, we must be able to justify the actions we take that affect others. Humans are capable of choosing to live a life in nonviolent harmony with other humans, non-humans, and the ecosystem. I do believe Woolf was working toward this harmonious existence in the ways she wrote about non-human animals. In Peter Cameron's afterword to Sigrid Nunez's book on the Wolf's marmoset myths, he speculates, do some writers appreciate or understand something about animals that others do not? I think that perhaps they do, for fiction writers are always attempting to penetrate and plumb the depths of alien consciousness. Both Nunez and Woolf make the leap from human mind to animal heart with gazelle-like certainty and grace. Flush and Mitz are as real and engaging as the humans with whom they cohabitate, and the reader delights in these interspecies menages, close quote. Indeed, Woolf's fictional treatments of non-human animals that I've mentioned in this paper demonstrate her sense of proper ethics in human-animal relations, which is born out of empathy for all living creatures. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Diana. That was, a really rich paper to start us off thinking about dogs and canine relations and canine community or non-human communities. Okay, next we have Oliver Case. Oliver is a PhD candidate and associate lecturer at the University of Worcester. His research combines ideas from post-human critical theory and Bergsonian philosophies of time to argue for the interrelatedness of Woolf's experiments in representing non-humanity and temporality. His work seeks new understandings of Virginia Woolf's late novels, which radically reposition her as a key author for the post-human term in literary studies. Oliver has recently written a chapter for Critical Insights, The Life and Works of Virginia Woolf, which will be published in autumn this year. And his paper today is Cross-Species Translations in Flush.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'll just share. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. Can I put my presentation?
Let me see if I can switch that. Give me one moment here.
Sure.
Let's see, more. I think if I make you a co-host now, you're able to.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very
Try
much.
it now. Okay, thank you. Sabrina, I'll also add you as a co-host.
Super. Thanks. So thank you again, Peter, for that introduction. As Peter says, I'm currently in the second year of my PhD, which is a project investigating Woolf's representations of the relationship between human and non-human beings. And I'm also looking at how that rightly preoccupation intersects with her other experiments in representing narrative temporality. But that's slightly less relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today. I was drafting a chapter on Orlando when the idea for this paper started to emerge, as a section of that chapter addresses a particular passage in Orlando in which Orlando has a moment of intensity or perhaps being with her dog Pippin, sorry. Now this moment I think represents a somewhat condensed experiment with cross-species translation, which is later extended in Woolf's second biography, Flush. But in my readings of that moment in Orlando, I took inspiration from Jacques Derrida's work in The Animal That Therefore I Am, which problematizes the species hierarchy by examining the origins of language and communication. And I'll attempt to do something similar today with Flush. But my intention isn't just to highlight those sections of Flush in which Woolf appears to anticipate Derrida's work on non-human communication, though I think she undoubtedly does, but also to show how we might enrich our understanding of Woolf's representations of a non-human-human interrelationship through exploring the idea of translating. Now, Derek Ryan's illuminating volume, Virginia Woolf and the Materiality of Theory, can't really be ignored in a paper like this one. His monograph provides one of the most richly detailed examinations of Derridean cross-species communication in Flush that I've been able to find. So my readings of Flush continue and extend the lines of interpretation that Ryan has begun here, but with a focus on the more semantic means by which cross-species communication may occur in the text, translating, what such translations might look like, and how the act of translating alters the relationship between human and non-human beings. So with the help of Derrida's interrogations of human and non-human communication, I believe that we find in Flush an anti-anthropocentric ethic of interrelation between human and non-human beings in Woolf's experiments with translating across species lines. Now, translating from one language to another often can't find absolute precision and might fail aesthetically if the primary aim is faithfulness to the text or language under translation. Although some meaning or truth is always put at risk and potentially lost, the act of translating constitutes, for critics like Dan Wiley, an affirmative ethical statement. Wiley describes anthropomorphism as a form of translating in quotation 1. And in a similar vein, Ryan argues that to anthropomorphize is to search for meaning in the full knowledge that it may never be found, but that the search itself is important as a gesture towards an understanding of the non-human, which doesn't seek always to subordinate the animal to the human viewpoint. I propose, though, that the act of translating in the more usual sense of the word, perhaps, rather than as a synonym for anthropomorphism, acknowledges a kind of difference, the heterogeneity and multiplicity of non-humanity. And rather than seeking to resolve that difference, it seeks instead to construct a common ground, a plane of being upon which properties such as the ability to speak in human language might not amount to a barrier to realizing our embeddedness within the non-human. Moreover, translation can't be avoided. It's the very means by which we understand the world and by which it understands us. Quotation 2 sets out Timothy Morton's object-oriented ontology, which maintains that all relations between all entities, human or non-human, distort the related entity into their own terms through a process of translation. So if translation is the lens through which we perceive the world, and indeed it perceives us, this denied creates something resembling a plane of immanence upon which we are related to every other being, and every other being is related to us through the same practices and processes. Now, one of the earliest passages which approaches what I will call the speech disparity between human and non-human beings in Flush is also one which somewhat anticipates Derrida's naked encounter with a cat in The Animal, in that it considers the experience of a reciprocal gaze and questions the degrees of separation and union which are laid bare in moments such as these. So I'll give you a minute now to read through that quotation on the slide, please. So here, Flush and Elizabeth Barrett gaze into each other's faces and find a simultaneous likeness and dissimilitude. While the biographer somehow knows that each felt this experience, there seems to be a failure of language at its very limits. Dashes and semicolons, pauses and unfinished sentences demonstrate the inadequacies of narrow human words to accurately translate the complexity of the interrelationship between Barrett and Flush, between human and non-human. But Woolf doesn't deny that the faculty of human language and speech signals a point of differentiation between the two here, but crucially doesn't give it the power to divide human from non-human, and instead exposes its limits, diminishes its authority as a mark of human superiority or elevation. So far from striving for an animal-human homogeneity then, Woolf expresses a heterogeneous and qualitative multiplicity, difference without division, by demonstrating the difficulty of and the need for translating across species lines. Now, Derrida's lecture, which became The Animal, Therefore I Am, considers the history of language in relation to the non-human and establishes ways of and reconstructing language so that Cartesian degrees of separation between human and animal can't be upheld. And quotation 4 sets out Derrida's often cited argument that we must resist thinking of the animal as the being which lacks speech, the faculty of language. We must instead think of the absence of this property affirmatively as different. If we don't deny the animal language, we don't denigrate all which doesn't speak. And Woolf, in the quotation on the previous slide, simultaneously alerts the reader to the speech disparity between Flush and Barrett, but at once affirms this not as a lack, but as blank difference. She spoke, he was dumb. If Woolf had instead written, he could not speak, the difference might be a lack. Instead, Flush's dumbness is a property rather than the absence of one. So Woolf starts to demonstrate an awareness of an idea really that Derrida develops decades later, that the non-human inability to speak in human language isn't a lack but a property, and isn't a marker of our superiority but merely of difference. And with this affirmation of difference, the need for translation, I think, becomes more pressing. So when we read quotation 5, we see at once that it's posed as a question. So many of Woolf's experiments with cross-species translation take the form of questions, and this is essential in indicating the uncertainty with which she proceeds, without assuming knowledge above and of the non-human being. Crucially, though, this uncertainty doesn't serve as a block, preventing the translator from even attempting to find modes of expression for the non-human experience. In quotation 6, Claudia Agera's discussion of Derrida's arguments in The Animal has some interesting resonances with Woolf's approach to translating across species lines here, because Woolf too is cognizant of the fact that language can't encapsulate the human, non-human interrelationship in Flush, but also that the abyss between human and dog, grounded in the speech disparity, encourages an intimacy which is beyond words or language. Now, critics like Derek Ryan and Marjorie Garber, who Ryan also quotes, I think, have noted that passages like quotation 5 negate the necessity of language for interspecies bonding. But I would argue further that intimacy between Flush and Barrett is generated not just by the absence of a shared language, but more so by the shared realization of the need for an attempt at translating the other. The attempt itself is more important than the success or accuracy of any translation, as Woolf observes that the misunderstandings which arise from such attempts don't lessen or inhibit the intimacy between human and dog. It's the shared experience of attempting to translate which engenders intimacy between the two. Now, some passages which describe Flush's desire to understand human communication may at first appear to anthropocentrically suggest that surely all non-human beings desire to become more human as a form of self-improvement. But when we reread these passages in the context of translating, a different interpretation, I think, seems more convincing. So I'll give you a minute now to read through this passage on the slide. Here, certainly Flush might desire to understand his owner's forms of communication, but there's no indication that this is a desire for human powers of language. As Ryan points out, he doesn't long to understand or speak the human language, but rather innumerable sounds, little simple sounds with mysterious meaning. Instead, Flush's desire is for the ability to translate these sounds into his own tongue. Likewise, where Woolf describes Flush watching Elizabeth Barrett writing, he doesn't desire the human property of literacy, but a medium which might not have a fixed meaning for each participant, is it writing or blackening paper, but through which they can both communicate with and understand the other. The fictional biographer, too, repeatedly admits their own inability to translate Flush's experience accurately. The constant questioning, along with phrases such as must have been, as if, and as though, which appear time and again throughout the text, where the biographer can't find the right words to express Flush's experience. These negate the significance of the fact that neither Flush nor the human writer or reader are necessarily capable of accurate translation, and instead affirms the importance of making an attempt, as the desire to translate is shared by both. Now, one of my favorite examples in Flush of cross-species translation in action also starts to prefigure Derridean thought in its implicit interrogation of what constitutes language. And when you read quotation 8, it's important to remember that here Woolf is writing as Flush, watching his owner. The language and the syntax used has a certain caninity, the stop-start flow of the sentence, the attentiveness to the sounds that Barrett is making, rather than the words she speaks. It's as if Flush is reading Barrett's movements and expressions and inflecting them with canine meanings that he can understand, translating human body language into canine body language. A parallel emerges here between Woolf's approach to cross-species translation and Derrida's focus on the foundations of language in quotation 9. So do please take a minute to read through that passage from Derrida now. So here, Derrida makes the case that if we consider the non-verbal and non-lexical origins of communication, the foundational marks and traces upon which all communication depends, show that complex communication isn't and never has been the exclusive property of the human. Of course, this rests on a redefinition of language as founded upon marks which are iterable, meaning not structurally readable, but repeatable in different contexts. So if communication has its origins in these iterable signs, it can't be considered solely human, as in the observable natural world. Animals too communicate using iterable signs, marks, and traces. But by thus complicating and problematizing the definition of language as exclusively human, these points from Derridean thought help to uncover what I think are the radical ethical claims that Flush makes regarding the nature of a human-non-human interrelationship. The focus on body language in quotation 8 shows a refusal to reduce communication to verbal language. And just as Flush relies on translating body language, so does the fictional biographer, interpreting Flush's bodily movements and expressions and translating them into thoughts and emotions comprehensible to the reader throughout the text. So in refocusing our attention on other forms of communication, and crucially how these might be translated from the dog to the human and vice versa, Woolf suggests that we can't claim superiority over the non-human on the basis of our ability to speak in human language. In presenting both human and dog as translators, perhaps we can say that Woolf gives us her own object-oriented ontology, suggesting that the only means available by which anything can understand anything else is translation. So Woolf's determination to establish a dynamic through which the human and non-human could translate each other constitutes a complex literary representation of a species interrelation and a dissolution of the species hierarchy. The anti-anthropocentric ethical claims the text makes in this regard prefigures and retrospectively enriches our understanding of arguments Derrida makes in his work on the human-animal relationship. And while critics have so far offered insightful analyses into the relationship between Flush and Barra, which do come to some similar conclusions, I find that the motif of translation adds new layers of complexity and richness to our readings of Woolf's attempts to represent a cross-species entanglement. By presenting both animal and human as translators, both desiring to translate and to understand the other, Woolf creates such a peculiar intimacy between the two halves of the supposed human-non-human divide, which challenges its very foundations and the ethical frameworks of anthropocentrism upon which it depends. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you, Ollie. Yeah, complexity and richness indeed. Thank you for that. Now, I forgot at the end of Diana's paper to actually take the break that I promised would be between papers. So I think we will take a 2-minute break now for Sabrina's paper, just to allow us to stretch our legs and maybe make a quick drink. So if we return at, let's say, just before 22, yeah, you'll hear my voice booming through your speakers, reconvening the panel. And Sabrina, maybe in the meantime, if you've got a PowerPoint presentation, you could get yourself set up. Okay, I'm going to suggest we restart things. So we have our final panelist, Sabrina Nacci. Sabrina is a master's student at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, another Worcester there. She is especially interested in children's literature and materiality studies, wherein she is fascinated by non-human voices, inspired by her passion for horseback riding and rescuing animals. After taking her first Woolf course in the spring, she heard about Flush and presented an earlier draft of this project. She would like to thank Dr. Candice Bond from Augusta University and Dr. Elizabeth Blake from Clark University, her undergraduate and graduate mentors who encouraged her and inspired her appreciation for Woolf and her many influential works. And her paper today is Nonverbal Communication Between Humans and Animals in Flush. So over to you, Sabrina.
Oh, wait, can you guys see the PowerPoint? Because it's not letting me share.
I don't think we can. Well, I certainly can't see it, I'm afraid.
I did make you a co-host. Let me try again. I know Ollie was able to. Let's try it again. So. Did you try to share screen?
I did.
Okay. Ollie, was there anything that you did extra to make yours work?
No, so once you gave me host access, that seemed to do the trick.
Well, let me just switch you over to host then, Sabrina. Maybe that'll be enough. Let's see. Now you're the full host.
It's not pulling up the PowerPoint. I might be able to try something though. I think it's my computer. My apologies.
That's okay.
Yeah, take
We're
your
all
time.
doing some troubleshooting here.
If you want, you could email it to me and I could share it from my end.
Okay. That'd be great.
I'll-
So sorry.
I'll message you my email address.
Okay.
Okay, I believe I sent it.
I'm just checking now. Okay, yeah, I got it through. So let me just save it and then I will share my screen.
Okay. Hopefully this will work. And then Sabrina, I'll probably have you switch me back to host if you can. We are having some people join and request access to the room.
Is that under settings?
It's in the upper right in participants. I think you can click on me and say like invite to make host.
Okay.
But it's not a big deal. If it's hard, go ahead with your presentation. So
Can everyone see the presentation now?
Yes.
Great. Sabrina, yeah, if you want to just let me know when to click to the next slide and I shall do so.
Okay. And I'm the host now. Thank you. And I'll make you a co-host again. So, all right, go ahead. I will step out of the way.
Great, thank you so much. Sorry about the tech difficulties. But yeah, so thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm very excited to be here and present my paper, Nonverbal Communication Between Humans and Animals in Virginia Woolf's Flesh. So in Virginia Woolf's novel Flesh, nonverbal forms of communication and shared physical spaces between humans and animals correspond with their social status. The novel, originally published in 1933, is inspired by Elizabeth Barrett Browning's piece, To Flesh My Dog, a poem dedicated to her purebred Cocker Spaniel Flesh. In Woolf's novel, the narrator follows the life of Flesh and his loyalty to Elizabeth, despite the linguistic, physical, and societal challenges they face. The novel is mostly seen through Flesh's perspective. However, Woolf, as a human writer, cannot definitively translate an animal's thoughts and emotions into words. Moreover, Elizabeth, as a human character, cannot fully understand Flesh's thoughts or reactions, but she does attempt to personify and speak for him. Elizabeth and Flesh communicate and build their relationships through body language and their interactions in shared spaces. They both admit their limitations in understanding each other, but they also demonstrate how verbal communication is not necessary to have an authentic relationship, wherein Woolf highlights their marginalized social positions as a woman and a dog in 19th century London. I argue Woolf investigates the boundary between humans and animals through the nonverbal communication between Flesh and Elizabeth, while also drawing attention to the limitations of masculine patriarchal language for expressing women's experiences and subjectivity. We could just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So Woolf was fond of the exclusive Cocker Spaniel breed after being gifted her own dog, Pinka, and she admired Elizabeth Barrett Browning's and Flesh's relationship as seen in her poem. Oh, if we could go to the next slide, I apologize. Thank you. So Elizabeth, as a young ill woman in the 19th century, has limited agency and mostly stays confined to her bed, self-aware, purebred Cocker Spaniel, the noted superior dog breed. And he attempts to maintain his own identity and elite status. However, throughout the novel, specifically when he is ignored or mistreated, Flesh discovers he lacks true agency, thus subjecting him to the same patriarchal system as Elizabeth. The narrator describes how there is also a hierarchy between dog breeds, where the Cocker Spaniel breed has been seen and treated highly by humans throughout history, at least in comparison to other dog breeds. However, not just any Cocker Spaniel could be a part of the Spaniel Club, wherein the dog's physical characteristics and appearances are considered. So if you can see the first picture on the slide, this one represents a Cocker Spaniel worthy of the club, whereas the one in the second picture possesses qualities seen as poorer. As illustrated in the first picture, his head must be smooth, rising without a too-decided stoop from the muzzle. The skull must be comparatively rounded and well-developed with plenty of room for brain power. The eyes must be full but not gozzled. The general expression must be one of intelligence and gentleness. If a dog, such as the one in the second picture with the wrongly carried eyes and bad expression, does not follow the criteria, they are cut off from the privileges of his kind. However, Flesh, the main character in Woolf's novel, doesn't need to worry, because he was a purebred Cocker Spaniel of the red variety, marked by all the characteristic excellences of his kind. Woolf ridicules these hierarchies from the very beginning, which also highlights that Flesh is special. He has an impressive pedigree and background, but he also possesses the physical characteristics that make him the right kind of Cocker Spaniel, making him desirable for humans who want an elite canine companion. Next slide, please. The speaker informs the readers that spaniels are by nature sympathetic. Flesh, as his story proves, had an excessive appreciation of human emotions. Before living with Miss Barrett, Flesh lived with the Mitford family, where he was aware of his status and used to his freedom. But his move to Wimpole Street in 1842 makes him realize that being a dog in this hierarchy does not grant him much agency, and his life depends on his beloved companion, Miss Barrett. When Flesh initially moves in with Miss Barrett, Flesh is distracted and confused about why Miss Mitford abandoned him there. However, once he recognizes Miss Barrett's presence, they start to bond and feel connected to each other, despite their clear differences as a dog and a human. Flush enjoys his freedom at the Mitford's house, but now his outdoor education was supplemented by that of the bedroom. When Flush first moves into the bedroom, Flush feels abandoned, frustrated, and scared until Miss Barrett speaks up and introduces herself. Next slide, please. Flush approaches her and notices that there was a likeness between them. As they gazed at each other, each felt, "Here am I," and then each felt, "But how different?" The narration shifts from Flush to both of them, going from very two different separate beings to one companionship. They both recognize their obvious differences as a human and a dog, but their confinement and lack of agency allow them to recognize that they are both similarly trapped in the bedroom together. Initially, Flush longs for his old family and the freedom of the outdoors, because that is all he was exposed to. But now, living with Miss Barrett, he begins his life as her companion and will live his life both for and through her. They are both trying to figure each other out, but they are unable to verbally communicate, so they rely on watching and observing each other to learn how to communicate and build a relationship. When contemplating the differences between humans and animals, Giorgio Agamben and Carrie Wheel both discuss how language defines the boundary between humans and animals. In Agamben's essay, The Open, Man and Animal, he reflects on how language has been considered the identifying characteristic of a human, where the passage from animal to man, despite the emphasis placed on comparative anatomy and paleontological findings, was produced by subtracting an element that had nothing to do with either one, and that instead was presupposed as the identifying characteristic of a human, language. Rather than focusing on the physical differences, the key differences between humans and animals is language. Language allows humans to be more rational creatures and therefore considered superior beings. Moreover, Carrie Wheel, in her book, Thinking Animals, Why Animal Studies Now, argues if each and every animal, including human animals, lives in its own non-communicating bubble, then we must assume we can have access only to the being of our own world and not to the being of others. Different types of animals have different speech patterns and languages, and since their methods of communication exist within those languages, it limits different animals from truly understanding each other. In Woolf's novel, Flush and Miss Barrett may attempt to communicate, but they also recognize how different they are. She was human, he was dog, thus closely united, thus immensely divided. As Wheel suggests, they both have their own languages and live in their separate bubble, but they learn to communicate with each other non-verbally, even when they didn't always understand each other. So as Miss Barrett and Flush recognize their physical differences and attempt to communicate, they also notice how often they misunderstand each other, especially early in the relationship. Miss Barrett watches Flush and notices how sometimes he reacts to some unknown thing, such as smelling food from downstairs, which is a rare example of when Miss Barrett, the human, lacks the kind of language that Flush, the dog, has access to. While scent is not necessarily a form of communication, it can indirectly help them communicate through Flush's body language, because it was in the world of smell that Flush mostly lived. Flush interacts with and understands the surrounding world through scent. Miss Barrett, as a human, may not rely on scent, but Flush physically reacts to the scents he encounters, even if he cannot verbally respond. Miss Barrett would watch and question, why did Flush tremble suddenly, and whimper, and start and listen? Flush would react and vocalize his feelings on his surroundings, but Miss Barrett does not always notice the same thing as Flush, leading to her inquiry about his behavior. Next slide, please. However, she can recognize Flush notices some things she cannot, because the fact was that they could not communicate with words, and it was a fact that led undoubtedly to much misunderstanding. Yet did it not also lead to a peculiar intimacy? The narrator questions whether their inability to verbally communicate with each other connects them in a way verbal communication cannot. Next slide, please. In recognizing their differences, Flush and Miss Barrett also seemingly recognize how the differences can bring them closer without the distractions of verbal language. While nonverbal communication has its own clear drawbacks, verbal communication has limitations that Flush and Miss Barrett do not have to consider in the relationship, specifically the limitations of language and communication in the patriarchal society that they occupy. Flush and Miss Barrett may occasionally misunderstand each other and try to consider the other's thoughts and intentions, but they do not try to speak for and silence the other. In the patriarchal society they inhabit, the voices of people and animals in marginalized groups like Miss Barrett are often lost or masked by people in higher powers. The humans in these positions use verbal communication to make sure their voices are heard, rather than those in marginalized groups, such as Miss Barrett and Flush, who rely on nonverbal communication. We can just go to the next slide, please. So Miss Barrett and Flush can often communicate and understand each other through eye contact. They engage with each other through watching each other's body language. And each character, human and non-human, seems deeply affected by gazing at the other's otherness. Both characters, one as a dog and another as an ill female, see each other as separate, independent beings, but they also understand each other's limitations. Flush may not understand how Miss Barrett's illness impacts her in society, but he does recognize that she is confined to her bedroom and limited in her correspondence with other humans, whereas he was used to more physical freedom in his home with the Midwards, and is now also trapped. Flush spends his time in the bedroom watching her, as she also watches him. And each character's look at the other causes them to think of their existential similarities and differences, hence disrupting their usual worldview and creating a possible space for an alternative mode of relation, or the peculiar intimacy Woolf suggests earlier. Their confinement and observations of each other force them to reflect on their interactions with each other and other characters. In recognizing their otherness, they can begin to relate more, but they mostly communicate in this way when they're alone in the bedroom together. While they mainly stay in the bedroom and interact with each other through body language and physical touch, Miss Barrett and Flush would occasionally go for a walk in Regent's Park, where Flush learns about his true place in the human patriarchy, wherein his human counterpart is seen lower in a male-dominated world, and Flush as a dog has even less agency. The language used in the rules that shape the outside world reflects this relationship. Reflects this hierarchy. Flush is very excited to escape the bedroom and explore the outside world with Miss Barrett, but he quickly learns walks do not lead to total freedom. Next slide, please. Because where they walk, in Regent's Park, dogs must be led on chains. And to this nucleus of knowledge, Flush quickly discovers dogs are not equal, but different. While confined to the bedroom, Flush had at least had some agency and could explore the room and socialize with Miss Barrett. However, when they left the room, Flush had to quietly walk alongside her, while Miss Barrett was able to socialize with other humans. When they are not in the room, the close connection between Miss Barrett and Flush fades because they are not always communicating and focusing on each other. Next slide, please. Miss Barrett often corresponds with other human characters through letters, and Flush sticks by her side as she writes, but he notices a difference in her demeanor when she starts writing to Robert Browning. The narrator notes that Flush could read signs that nobody else could even see. He could tell by the touch of Miss Barrett's fingers that she was waiting for one thing only. As Miss Barrett begins writing to Robert, her interactions, including physical touch, with Flush would change. She would be stroking him, perhaps with a light, regular movement. Suddenly, there was the rap. Her fingers constricted. Flush can sense how Miss Barrett's demeanor and emotions shift by the way she is petting him. Next slide, please. Flush watches how she physically and mentally seems to heal, but it was not merely that Miss Barrett was changing towards Mr. Browning. She was changing in every relation. She was changing in her feelings toward Flush himself. She starts to ignore Flush, and his usual loyal and sweet conduct changes. And as his vanity was exasperated, next slide, please, his jealousy was inflamed. He flung himself on Mr. Browning and bit him savagely. But Mr. Browning brushed him off with a flick of his hand and went talking. While Miss Barrett did not immediately react to Flush's actions with Mr. Browning around, when Mr. Browning left, first she slapped his ears. That was nothing. But then she said in her sober, certain tones that she would never love him again. While Miss Barrett and Flush typically rely on nonverbal communication to build on their trust and relationship, it's verbal communication that becomes more destructive to their relationship after the incident with Mr. Browning. Miss Barrett later forgives Flush, but her relationship with Mr. Browning changes her behavior and tone towards him. Flush's and Miss Barrett's relationship, despite the initial improvements with their communication, seems to dwindle the more Miss Barrett escapes the room and socializes with Browning. Miss Barrett and Flush recognize that their social statuses as the relationship begins to weaken. When they spend their days alone together, confined to the room, next slide, please, Flush had only to leap on her sofa, and Miss Barrett stared wide awake and looked at him. Now he leapt onto the sofa, but she didn't notice him. She looked through him as if he were invisible. Unlike the beginning of the novel, where Miss Barrett sought out companionship through Flush, she now relies on her human companions, which gives her more agency and allows her to live her life outside of the bedroom on Wimpole Street. However, both woman and dog recognizing their subordinate positions reflects not their acceptance of a natural order, but their internalization of power structures that privilege the male and thus fully human subject. As Miss Barrett reintegrates into society and spends her time with human companions instead of flesh, they also reinforce the hierarchy they're subjected to, where Miss Barrett may be an ill woman in 19th century London, but flesh is a dog who has no voice in a human world. And living and building a relationship with each other, Flesh and Miss Barrett recognize they're both seen as lower class in a patriarchal society, but they do find some comfort together. When Flesh and Miss Barrett are physically alone together, they behave completely different than when they're with others, as they can communicate with each other through eye contact, body language, and physical touch. However, when Miss Barrett starts escaping the bedroom and socializing with other human characters like Browning, she tends to ignore Flesh, and Flesh discovers he's not as high class as he originally thought he was. Consequently, in considering the nonverbal communication and dynamics between them, they're also reinforcing their positions in the hierarchy and highlighting the limitations of verbal communication in the same patriarchy. Thank you so much. Oh, and here's my works cited.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sabrina. I'm going to stop sharing now and go back. That was, another fantastic paper. And I feel like we've had it from this panel, a really comprehensive overview of the novel. It's almost like, sort of digesting the novel over again. So what I'm going to suggest we do is take another short break. So let's say 3 minutes or so. So 3 minutes past the hour, we will reconvene and launch into the Q&A. Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. So as with the other panels, either please raise your hand so you come to the top of my screen, or type something into the chat box and I will read it aloud. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of things we're wanting to ask about Flush off the back of those papers. We have a question from Vicky and then Helen. So Vicky first.
Sure. Thank you so much for these lovely papers. I'm so glad to revisit Flush. And I've been teaching it recently and sort of, working with students through this text. So many illuminating connections for me. One question that I have for Ollie and Sabrina, I was seeing all kinds of kind of interconnections between your papers. And I think, thinking about translation as a figure for sort of cross-species communication, I think is really fruitful. And so I'm wondering what the sensory implications of this are. Sabrina, in your presentation, there's that lovely moment in which the narrator sort of remarks that Flush has an excessive appreciation of human emotions, kind of representing Flush as a really able translator. But as we think about forging forms of communication or translation, Flush is, has strong aptitudes for smell or scent, and he kind of lives by the world of scent. Is this a space where Elizabeth needs to kind of cultivate a relationship to scent that might enable her to, translate across the species divide? And I think, Freud connects women so closely with scent, as though kind of noting that as a particular, gendered aptitude that might make women more productive in that form of translation.
I can go first. Yeah, I think that Flush, it's the quote, Flush lives in the world of scent. And I think that is a form of translation, because I don't think it's like necessarily a form of communication, but I think it's where Flush starts to react, that Elizabeth needs to kind of translate his emotions, translate his reactions. And then that leads into the actual form of communication. So it's more about watching body language and what she sees.
I think also just to add on to that, what you were saying, Vicky, about the intensity of Flush's ability to smell being so much greater than Elizabeth Barrett's, and in that sense, it is a kind of a platform of potential communication that is unreachable to some degree. I think that was, I mean, I was kind of trying to communicate the importance of making an attempt, even though what you're attempting might be entirely impossible. There seems to be this kind of dynamic of equality between them, I guess, in that Barrett's, I feel that Barrett feels she's allowed to try to experience something beyond the human, if that's at all related to your question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's so sorry. Oh, I was just going to add that, yeah, I think thinking of it as a platform, because I think as I mentioned in the presentation, it's, Elizabeth as a human doesn't necessarily rely on scent, but Flush does. But he also relies on other senses. So it's more of a platform that he uses to begin that translation, as Ollie was talking about. So yeah, it's a great question. Thank you.
Sorry, I was speaking into a muted microphone. I was just saying, Ellen, if you'd like to.
Okay. I enjoyed all three papers very much. I've assigned Woolf's short fiction twice to students, and I've done Gypsy the Mongrel and The Widow's Parrot. And I was so glad to see those two there, because they're hardly ever mentioned. And I just want to tell you that people really enjoy Widow and the Parrot. Two comments. I very much liked Sabrina's comment that animals escape patriarchal codes. And one book you haven't mentioned is Temple Grandin's Animals in Translation, where she talks about how animals do not have neurotypical codes by which people judge one another. Yet the human being will judge the other person because you don't have all these written codes that neurotypicals. I'm talking about, of course, disabled people. I'm talking from the point of view of autism here. And that makes a joy of being with an animal, because the animal is not judging you all the time. I wonder just if anybody could speak to whether Woolf's liking of animals came from the fact that she might not have been able to cope with people as well as somebody less smart. The second comment is everybody's remarked on how, I agree with this, that I put it this way, language is a way human beings can have an excuse for treating, the animal's lack of language enables human beings to mistreat them. They get away with mistreating animals because they don't have language. It's a sort of excuse. But my comment is, if anyone talks about this, everybody experiences how little we communicate to one another, even though we have language. You could be married to somebody for 50 years and not knowing them and be talking to them all the time. So as anybody these two things in her text, does she ever talk about the great joy of being with that, the business of escaping all codes with an animal, and on the other hand, the business of the human beings thinking that they're interacting through language are actually missing a lot? Anybody want to talk to that? I think that's part of the enjoyment of her present. She says lots of places she presents animals in all kinds of small ways. So that's my comment, if anybody wants to comment on any of that. You don't forget Ken Temple Grandin's Animals in Translation, because that's a very important, her basic topic are cattle and things like that, but they're animals too. Don't know if anybody wants to.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can go first. I really like your comment about just like, you know, there are so many distractions in verbal communication. Like we say, we can understand each other a lot easier, but you know, even with verbal communications, there are still so many distractions, but we just say that there are not. You know, sometimes sometimes the body language, like even when two humans are communicating, you can see the body language like shifts or something, and you can tell maybe they're not saying what they think what they're saying. So I think it's a great comment. I didn't completely expand on it in my paper for this for the scope of this project, but I do want to look into it more. So thank you.
And I think also with interpreting body language in that way, there's a kind of slipperiness to it in that it's a bit like, because we're so used to listening or reading what people think or say, when it comes to just interpreting body language and just translating body language, there's always a kind of another degree of uncertainty, I think, which is really interesting.
Diana, did you want to speak to Ellen's point?
Yeah, I was just going to say there are plenty of awkward conversations in Woolf, that's for sure. Just Lily and Mr. Ramsey spring to mind here when she comments on his boots because she can't think of anything else to say. But that's really all I had to say.
Okay, we have more hands up. Kaylee, your hand was raised. Would you like to go ahead and pose your question?
Sure, I loved all three papers. They're just so beautifully written. I had a question. I think it will apply to all three of you. I noticed so many, like I was looking at the grammatical structures of the quotes that you all provided, and just so many semicolons, you know, and we all know Woolf's experimental use of semicolons. I did some research on human non-human communication in 18th century texts, and instead of semicolons, there's usually a lot more dashes. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on Woolf's use of those kinds of grammatical structures. I mean, obviously it doesn't always conform. And if you had any thoughts on that connection, because it probably goes back to the language and the structure of that communication. That's kind of a question comment. I do apologize, but thank you all.
So I can go first. In my personal experience of reading Woolf's grammar, I tend to kind of naturally see dashes as more of a kind of intentional pause, and semicolons as a kind of an indication of a kind of disconnection or something kind of not quite fitting together. Which I think is what's so clever about, right, the way she uses semicolons. And I think there was a passage that I mentioned semicolons to kind of indicate the kind of impenetrability of the translating work that's going on.
Diana, Sabrina, do you want to come in on that yourselves? No. Okay. Well, we have.
Really haven't considered it. Well, I mean, looking in the language and discussions, but I haven't really considered it for this paper. But yeah, like when communicating, I don't know, when communicating with an animal, like if writing down the dialogue would change. I don't know. That's a really interesting question. I would love to look at it more.
I just want to echo what Kaylee's put in the chat. I think I absolutely agree. Semicolons do feel more fluid than dashes, but in that fluidity is a kind of uncertainty, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how the innovations in figuration that Woolf is and other writers are using punctuation and grammar and syntax, and that we might consider that when tracing these animals, and what people like Woolf are doing with animal life and ethics. Derek, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. What a fabulous panel, and great to see Flush centre stage. Jeannie and I were messaging during one of the papers about how, a number of years ago, we were struggling to get Flush on the conference programme. And now, it feels like it's everywhere. So that's wonderful to see. A couple of comments that might form into a question, or perhaps you'll be able to make a question out of the comments. First thing is just to say how much I appreciated this motif of translation that ran through all the papers. Actually, you have obviously Ollie, this kind of need or desire for translation in the text. And then you have the translations of smell into language. But also I thought, Diana, you could think about the depiction of animal suffering, animal pain, as Woolf trying to kind of translate that into empathy, or the reader translating that into empathy in some way. So I thought all of that was great. My main comment though is for Sabrina, and it's about this issue of smell, because I was reading recently from a book that I'm actually going to cite later on, a book by Nathan Snazer, where he has a chapter on smell in James Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man. And what he says in the chapter, it's really, really fascinating, because he talks about how, we often read these depictions of smell as a way in which writers are drawing our attention to differences, different sensory capacities that non-human animals have compared to humans. But he points out that, we do smell, humans do smell as well. And perhaps one of the things these texts are doing is reminding us of the importance of smell to humans as well, making us attuned to how we navigate the world through smell in our own way, and how that might allow some kind of connection with the non-human, perhaps a way to think about how we've undervalued smell. And he talks about Freud and others who've kind of set up that undervaluing of smell and privileging of sight and language, and various other ways in which we think of the human as different from the animal. And not to go on about COVID, but this is something that we're probably all particularly attuned to, given how many of us will have had that really strange experience of losing the sense of smell for a period of time, if we call it COVID. So anyway, that was just a thought, and I hope someone could say something more about it.
I think we kind of do undervalue like smell, because we do use it like daily, but we don't rely on it maybe as like dogs do. That's kind of their connection to the world, even if we have it. So I guess it's a question of how do we access the world through scent compared to our other senses? Because I agree, we do kind of undervalue it. But yeah, no, that's a great point.
I liked what you were saying as well, Derek, about I mean, like the need to emphasize the fact that we do still smell. It might not be to the same intensity as a dog, but we do have that sense. And in that sense, like the difference between a dog and a human, or another animal and a human, in the sense of smell, is more of a difference of degree than kind, right? To badly quote Bergson. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Elizabeth will still smell the food being cooked, or like, like the humans around will still smell the cooked food, but it's more of the excitement and response of Flush compared to Elizabeth, I guess. So, I mean, it's really about the reactions and how to translate that then between them.
Okay, we have a hand raised by Kelly, if you'd like to pose your question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm always so terrible at like getting my thoughts together to actually ask a cohesive question. But I'm really interested in the way all of these papers were thinking through ideas of how we can connect across species non-verbally. But I'm also interested, have you all thought about the ways in which what Woolf is silent about is sort of eliding the disconnects also across the species? And I know, Ollie, you brought in Derrida and his cat, I think, and thinking about issues of things like animal sexuality or their sort of lack of modesty. And I was reminded also of sort of this idea of, what we're supposed to be shown or seen, when Diana actually brought up that scene in Voyage with the beheading of the chicken, where they go out and they're on sort of the wrong side of the hotel. And I am also thinking back to how that changed from Melambrosia, where they sort of just reacted with silence instead of a commentary on the humaneness of that. So I'm curious if anyone wants to sort of speak to what the limitations are, what we're sort of not getting in terms of animal-human relationships, and the gap based on sort of her selectivity and respectability that she's maybe prioritizing. I don't know if that made sense.
I wasn't aware of the change from Melambrosia to the Voyage Out, because I haven't read all of Melambrosia, but I will go look at that now since you've alerted me to it. But that's really all I had to say. I'm sorry.
Would anyone?
Question.
Sabrina, would you like to come in on this?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking just like how sometimes silence can speak louder than actual verbal communication. I think, sometimes like when they either Flush or Elizabeth try to speak for each other, they may not always actually like really say what the other is thinking. So I mean, I think there is a gap. You can always, like, by looking at body language, you can see kind of like if they're scared of something or if they're excited about something, you can start to translate it, but there is always limitations because maybe say Flush was simply excited about the food, like it's excited about the food, but then say Elizabeth tried to translate it into the food plus something else. I think trying to, like, I guess, over translate it and make it more complex than needed. I think it depends on the situation, and if the human wants to use verbal communication to translate it and to make it even more complex, if that makes sense.
Ollie, did you want to come in on this, or?
I'm trying to formulate something valuable worth saying, but this feels like yeah, something that needs a whole other presentation or a whole other essay. But thank you for so much thought provocation.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was kind of
Oh,
obsessed.
no.
We do have one more question, or one further question, but just before we get there, Kelly's question and Diana's paper sparked a thought in me, which was this week I happened to reread Craftsmanship, and I was struck and had written down that talk begins with Woolf saying, when you cut the head off of the talk, it behaves like a hen that has been decapitated. It runs around in a circle till it drops dead. So people say who have killed hens. There's no comment of mine there. I just observed it and noted it down, and I hadn't made the connection all the way back with that moment in the voyage out. You know, at the other end of Woolf's writing career, there's an interesting reoccurrence of an animal metaphor of violence that's being repurposed in some way there. But yeah, just a comment really. And we do have one more question from Jeannie.
Wow, thank you so much for such wonderful papers. And just a couple of comments. Diana, it's just incredible how much Woolf really attends to the kind of violence that she sees around her and how we process it. And I was really glad to hear your paper about that. The question of smell makes me think about the book Timbuktu by Paul Auster, where the main character wants to, Willie G. Christmas, he wants to connect with his dog, Mr. Bones, through smell. And Ollie, as you were talking, and also to some extent, Sabrina, you talked about how Flush kind of longs to kind of communicate. And yet we don't see that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wants to communicate to Flush through smell. And if you think about how we are primates and we communicate through visual by looking at each other, dogs communicate through smelling each other's butts, which is not what we do. And so we socialize dogs to kind of communicate the way we do. But I think it's interesting that Woolf understands how Flush sees the world or experiences the world through smell. And she doesn't emphasize that as much with humans in London at the Whitechapel and why am I spacing out? Whitehall are cheek by jowl. And so Elizabeth Barrett Browning would have smelled things. And it's interesting that Woolf in Recreating London doesn't bring that in, but this panel and this discussion is making me want to go back and look at not just how Flush smells, but the smells in the book. And so anyway, I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, about, you know, how Woolf gets it, but she doesn't put that into Barrett Browning's head. And I guess I'm also reminded as you were talking how much Woolf just really paid attention. I don't think she was the biggest dog lover in the world, but she really wanted to kind of get what it feels like to be a dog. And she does that so well in Flush, even if she's not the biggest dog lover. And so it's interesting how we see that, and we don't see Barrett Browning. I don't know. She doesn't put that into Barrett Browning's head as much. But anyway, thank you for, I guess I was commenting rather than asking something, but you're making me now want to revisit smell in Woolf and how she recreates that, maybe not even just in Flush, but in her other novels. Sorry, I'll stop here.
Who would like to jump in and respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start by saying thank you for the comment. I mean, there's so much to think about in terms of smell here that I hadn't really considered. So thank you to Derek for starting that conversation as well. I think, yeah, in terms of what you were saying about Woolf's personal relationship with dogs. I always kind of thought from the diaries and letters and things that she has a more animal relationship with the dog than a human relationship with the dog, which is something that I have so much admiration for to begin with. And it does bother me that doesn't filter through into Flush. It does kind of, I'm left wanting in that regard. Absolutely.
Yeah, now I want to go back into the novel and really focus on like the other, because there are, humans do obviously smell, and there are like so many scents, like going from the bedroom to Regent's Park and to all the places in the novel. So I do really want to go back and like look at how the humans are smelling, like, or the scents that they encounter, and if the humans do react at all, because it doesn't seem like they react a lot, because this emphasis on scent is on Flush, because that's the world he lives in. Whereas, Barrett Browning and everyone else, like, they focus on the verbal communication. So I think that's really interesting to think about.
I should say as well, this is kind of a self-plug, but Jeannie has an excellent chapter on animal trauma, thinking about ethics of human-animal relationships in the edited collection Derek and I brought out a couple of years ago on Woolf, Europe and Peace. So would recommend going to that chapter to think more about some of these questions. We are at time, and here in Scotland, it is time for me to go and feed my dog and also myself before the round table. So we will wrap things up, I think. But thank you. Can we, sort of virtually say thank you to our panelists again for a fantastic panel on Flush. And we'll leave it there.
Before we all go, does anyone mind if I save the chat? We good with that?
Go right ahead.
Please do. Otherwise, I will. But either way, I think we were supposed to kind of document it for future things. So if you would, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, we'll see you all for the round table.
Thank you,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.